Traveling out of town. I was out of town until about 8 o'clock last night. So we continue to pray for those that are on the roads and hope they'll be back with us soon. We're going to have a little smaller class than normal, but that's okay. We're going to do just fine with the group that we have. Yeah, I think even we have a young adult class in the back that meets with Jim Gill, and he's not here either, so we might get a few of there. A few of them will have to suffer with me this morning. A few weeks ago, I think it was actually 2 weeks ago, we were talking about the Jerusalem principle. And I thought it'd be good to summarize what that principle was. It was that Christian stewardship could address major schisms or challenges and problems in the church. And that was one of the great benefits of stewardship and why it's not just something that we should do, it's something that we must do. And then last week, we were getting into the Macedonian principle. I haven't finished defining that term or explaining it completely. I never really just open up with what I mean by these terms. I'll let you just kind of organically figure it out as we go along. But, I will give you a bit of a summary. The foundation of stewardship has to be internal. It's got to be found in the heart and the mind. And some of the lesson of this week, and I don't know if this might be a little convoluted, I didn't have as much time this weekend to prepare as I normally do, but I'm going to tell a little story. I went to my wife's childhood home, or not even her childhood, her teenage home of Commerce, Georgia, this weekend, and I went home to see mainly the family. A mother and a father had passed away. They were old. And one the gentleman had passed away during COVID. And because of the circumstances, wasn't able to have a proper funeral or an opportunity for family and friends to come and gather. And now the wife has passed away. And again, she was in a nursing home. She had lost her memory. She had suffered from Alzheimer's late in her life. And it was a pretty joyful funeral in the sense that these two people lived great Christian lives and were a great example. And I knew them pretty well. They were part of the childhood congregation that I was a member of when I was when I was first baptized, when I was a young man. And that congregation was small, about the size of Central, maybe a little large. Well, probably about exactly the size of Central, actually. It seemed bigger when I was a small child. And but it's amazing that all those families, I still have connections to almost all of them. And I was trying to just rattle off all the families, the groups that I remember from that congregation. And this was one of them. And I'm kind of rambling, but when I was ready to go to college, I realized I needed to, for the first time in my life, I got to pick a congregation to worship with. Never have had that opportunity in my life. And unlike some college kids, I didn't look at it as an opportunity. Well, I don't have to go to church every Sunday now. I can just go when I feel like it. No one's going to be watching up on me. I just knew that I was going to break. I'd heard enough of those sermons about losing the young people, and I said, yeah, I'm going to break that cycle, at least in my family. I know that. And my brother has been a faithful Christian all his life, too. So my parents got very fortunate, and fortunate's probably not the word. They probably raised us in a way that was more likely to happen than not. But I said, you know what? I'm going to pick out a congregation. I'm going to be so excited. And maybe this one will have a youth group. I've never been a part of a youth group. I've never been a part of a congregation large enough to have much of a youth group. We traveled a lot to things. And the son of this husband and wife that just had their funeral, that just passed away, he was back from college. He was a young professional. And he felt he needed to, I've never actually heard him say the words, but I think he needed to give the young people in our congregation an opportunity to do some of the things that he didn't get to do when he was a young person, didn't have a youth group, didn't have a lot of Christian friends that were always with him in the congregation. And he took it upon himself. I don't think he was ever told. He was never a deacon. He was unmarried at the time. He was never told to be I need you to supervise the youth or try to give, Rob and Jonathan Stroud an opportunity to associate with other Christians. But he made it a point that every time there was a youth rally in the area, if there was a function that he could take us to, he would stop what he was doing on his weekend and he would drive us there. And he took us to a lot of different things. And I mean, I think about it like maybe 10 or 12 things a year he would take us to, and it was no distance was too far to get us to it. And I just think back on the sacrifice that he made. And then when I was choosing where I wanted to go to school, he had decided to shift jobs. His name was Jeff Colson. And he decided to take a job as a preacher. And nobody, as good a young man as he was, no one imagined him as a preacher. No one imagined that would be what he would do. In fact, he was in counseling, and he was basically on a medical career. He worked in a center for the truly insane, or people that really had major problems. But he gave up that career and decided to become a preacher, and went to Commerce, Georgia, which is not too far from Athens, Georgia. And I went to the University of Georgia there. And I'm realizing this story is going to go a lot longer than it should have. But sight unseen, I knew that Jeff Colson had taken this preaching job. I still couldn't imagine him as a preacher. I'd never heard him preach, never thought of him as a preacher, but he had decided to become a preacher, and he had taken this job as a preacher there. And sight unseen, I don't even think the internet was really good at mapping things then, but I asked, how far is Commerce from Athens? I'd never been to Athens or Commerce before I decided to go to school in the University of Georgia. And they said, hey, 25, 30 minutes, not too far. And I said, well, that's it. I'm going to go to church in Commerce, Georgia. I'm going to Commerce, Georgia. And the very first time I ever visited the church was the day that I, in a sense, placed membership with that congregation, said, this is my church. And I walked in the door, and I said, I have made a terrible mistake. That's the first thought in my mind. It wasn't a mistake, but that's the first thought in my mind. I walked in, and this church building was literally on the grounds of a nursing home. And the members of this congregation were mostly those that could be wheeled into the congregation. And there goes my thoughts of a youth group. I was easily the youngest person there, and the next youngest was Jeff Colson, who was about 30 years old at the time. And after that, there was probably a 20-year gap before we got to the next youngest person in the congregation. And I'm like, this is not the congregation I imagine choosing when I'm in college. And I'm gonna, I was not married. I didn't have any connections to anybody in Athens. I was starting over completely with church, family, friends. Eventually found my wife there while we were in the University of Georgia. But I stayed at that congregation. And I think back on why I stayed. And I'm sorry to say that the original reason I stayed was I felt a sense of obligation. Because I had already shot my mouth off and told Jeff I was going to be a member of that congregation. And I didn't know how I could not follow through. Because, I mean, he had problems too. He was a preacher at a congregation where the average age was probably about 65, 70 years old. And he was a first-time preacher, and he was trying to help build up that church. Didn't have elders at the time. It needed a lot of help. And it turned out to be the greatest thing that possibly could have happened for me, but I'm not sure, looking back at it and thinking about the lesson that we're going to be talking about today, that I had my mind right, because I was doing it more out of a sense of obligation to Jeff and more out of an obligation to, well, I'm a man of my word. If I say I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. I've always been stubborn like that, and I don't handle losses. And sometimes, why do we have that attitude? It's more about what people think of us than it is about, I'm not sure the love of God was entering into everything I was thinking back then. I've always told this story as a story that I'm proud of, but I think back and think, you know what? I think the love of God came, but it didn't come right away. It felt more like an obligation at first. And I think sometimes we get through our Christian lives as our obligations to others, our obligations to our family, our obligations to even the way it makes us look or makes us feel when in the eyes of others, but we don't have the complete idea of giving our heart and giving our mind and giving our will to God. That's a long way to start about the Macedonian principle, but the foundation of stewardship, true stewardship, and that gets into this interesting idea. I served the Commerce Church of Christ. I became the de facto youth minister. I did everything Jeff did for me. We eventually started driving through the little trailer parks in Commerce, and we found a lot of families that were willing to send their kids. They weren't willing to come, but they were willing to send their kids to church through VBS or through some other things like that. And we did build up a little bit of a youth group there. We had 10 or 12 kids that would come and be in the, quote, teenage class, or the middle school teenage class that we would, middle school and high school teenage class that I would teach. And we got into the Bible Bowl, and we got into youth rallies and going things. I got them to start going to camp where I had gone at my childhood camp. And a lot of things happened there. And every Sunday and Wednesday, my car I didn't have anybody else in the car with me, so I would fill it up with 3 or 4 people that I could pick up. I knew we could get some kids in my Bible class if I went to the house and picked them up. And again, I don't know if these mothers were just looking for babysitting or just some relief, but if that's what it took to get some people in the Bible class, I was determined to do it. So I found all kinds of ways to serve, but eventually, I think it became a love for their souls and their goodwill, but I honestly believe it started off as a sense of, I felt it was just an obligation. It was something I had to do. Whether I felt it or not, whether I felt like I needed to do it or not, it was an obligation. And we can't allow our Christian life to be all obligation. Like, well, these are the rules. I got to follow it. I'm miserable while I'm doing it, but I'm going to keep doing it because I know that's what I'm supposed to do. We've got to get it to the point where it's something we want to do because we are grateful. We are so fortunate, and we want to share what we have. Foundation of stewardship must be internal. It's found in the heart. It's found in the mind. We sometimes think material wealth is a foundation of stewardship, and it's not, as we continue talking about the Macedonians. And we got a little bit into this last week, so I know I'm recapping some things. The way we use our material things is completely an expression of what's in our heart. Stewardship flows from the heart that has to be full of gratitude. And that gets to the point, and we see examples, and we're not going to go over these examples, but we see examples in the New Testament and the Old Testament of people who give, but they don't give with the right heart, and therefore God rejects it. God's not happy with that gift. Doesn't matter how generous it is in the eyes of men, if God knows the heart is not right, or there's ulterior motives for why it's being given, then it's worthless in His eyes. If our heart and our mind belong to God, we use material things in God's best interest. And every Christian, we talked about last week, has a spiritual need to be a steward, and stewardship is frequently presented as that responsibility, but we've got to start thinking of it as a need. It's something we need to do if we're going to be Christians, not a responsibility. Stewardship provides Christians with an avenue for expressing our appreciation and our gratitude. Why do we have this appreciation and gratitude? Because we live and breathe and remember every single day that God's grace has been given to us, and therefore this is a small thing that we can do to give our grace to others, reflect God's grace in our lives. I think many conscientious Christians willingly give to others, but they also they reject receiving from others. And we talked about last week the idea that sometimes it's really hard for us as good Christians to accept stewardship from others and realize that it's got to be a two-way street. And when we say, oh, no, you can't do that for me. Don't do that for me. Find someone else to help or find someone else to be a benefit to. We are literally putting up a wall and saying we're not allowing those people to be the stewards they want to be. And we're going to be talking about that with the Macedonians. A lot of us will rejoice in helping, but absolutely do not wish to be helped. And we don't do that consciously sometimes. We just keep things to ourselves, keep it quiet, somehow feel it's a weakness to share the areas that we need help with. I often think that maybe, we need to do a better job of sharing the struggles in our life with one another, to find brothers and sisters that we can share those things with. Each Christian has a need to be a steward, and each Christian also has the responsibility to allow others to practice stewardship towards them. So, 2 Corinthians chapter 8. We read the first 3 verses last week, but we'll reread them just to catch up everybody that's new in the audience or that has let it slip their mind what we talked about last week, and then we'll finally be into the new part of the lesson starting now. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, we'll read the first 3 verses, then we'll keep going. We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means of their own accord. So Paul is talking to the Corinthian Christians, a Gentile congregation, but he's talking about the Macedonian church, and he talks about the grace of God that is expressed by the Macedonian congregations. And again, that's what we're talking about. They felt so grateful in their lives, so fortunate in their lives. They were excited at the opportunity they got to give back. And this time it was material wealth. It was financial wealth. And wealth is probably not the word, because what word do we see here in these first 3 verses that expresses their financial state? Poverty. But they didn't see it as having nothing. They saw it as, we have something. We have something. And before God came into our lives, we had nothing. And we have those spiritual blessings, and now we're being asked to give of our material blessings, and we may not have much, but we have something to give. Macedonian Christians existed, as Paul writes here, in a severe test of affliction. And I'm not sure that's purely financial, but obviously poverty is a big part of that. But whatever their test of affliction is, again, it is so easy to get distracted when we are in a severe test of affliction. I think everybody in here, everybody in here is imagining something else in their life that was their severe test of affliction. Death of a loved one, financial dire straits, loss of a job, separation from family. I mean, there's so many different things that we face that could be our severe test of affliction. And think about that depth that pit you were in at that moment, and think, did I remember how grateful I was? Did I remember how much gratitude I had in my heart? And if an opportunity came to be a steward to someone else, would I have seized upon that at that moment? Or was I in a frame of mind where I was consumed by it, where I couldn't think of anything but what was wrong in my life at that moment? We talked about life was tough for the Macedonian Christians. And when life is tough, it's easy to only think of ourselves. I mean, why would we think of anything else? If you smash your finger with a hammer and it is overwhelmingly painful, it's hard to be thinking about, I wonder how my son's doing in the other room. It's hard to put anything else in your mind, because the pain and suffering of that moment overwhelms us. But yet the Macedonians did. They overcame it. Despite their circumstances, what was said about their joy in these first 3 verses? It was an abundance. It was an abundance of joy. Their joy was abundant because their joy was what God had given them, and they really, truly felt grateful. That's where this idea of coming, we're going to talk about it in a moment, this idea of if your Christian life is obligation instead of gratitude. No doubt there's obligation in our life. We're obligated to do things as Christians. But if that's the only thing that motivates us to come to church and be Christians and to do what we're told, every time we hear that invitation or hear that sermon that hits a little too close to home, I feel obligated, I better do better. If it's only obligation and maybe even guilt for not doing the right thing, well, we've got to move it into the level of, nope, it's that's there, that's part of it, but what's really the motivating factor is the gratitude for God. Is the gratitude that this world is not our only home, this is not the end of the story, that there is something that we are grateful for and we are going to receive it, and it has already been given to us, and that we need to reflect that gratitude in our lives. The Macedonian Christians experienced joy because they had a relationship with God. They had a real relationship with God. An abundance of joy plus deep poverty, that's a mathematical equation here. Abundance of joy plus deep poverty somehow equaled, what does that say in verse 2? An overflow of wealth. An overflow in a wealth of generosity on their part. It's an overflow of generosity. Somehow, deep poverty plus abundant joy still produced an overflow of generosity on their part. These Christians living in deep poverty were still able to be incredibly generous. Now, I don't know if they had budget reports and they would add up all the money from all the different congregations, put it on a piece of paper and hand it to somebody. And in that line list, the gift to the Macedonian church may have been tiny. It may have been very small. But Paul knew what they gave. God knew what they gave. And what they were able to give is described here as incredibly generous. Maybe not incredibly much, but incredibly generous for what they were able to give. And then finally in verse 3, Paul states two facts about the gift they gave. Number one, they gave according to their ability. And number two, they gave beyond their means. Now, how can you give according to your ability and beyond your means? Are those contradictions? I don't know. They sound almost contradictory. But they gave whatever they possibly could, and they gave beyond their means. And the way I interpret that is they gave beyond what was at all comfortable or necessary for them to give. They gave beyond what they could really afford to give. That means there was going to be some suffering on the end of that gift on their part. It was going to be truly a sacrifice. Why were they able to give like that? Because they didn't look at their poverty. What did they see? Well, they saw their joy, and they saw, we might be in poverty, but we still have ability. We still have something. And we talked about this a couple weeks ago, is that if we get so overwhelmed with, well, my gift won't mean anything, it's not enough, it's just a drop in the bucket, there's so much problems out there, and whatever I can give to God is so inconsequential compared to the struggle that is outside this building, that we need to, the problems that we as the church need to solve or help be a part of the solution. But if we look at it like that, we will feel overwhelmed. But if we look at it as somebody is going to walk in my path today that needs Jesus Christ, and I may not be able to save him. Well, I can't save him, but I can certainly be part of the solution to saving him, whether he chooses it or not. I can be an influence somehow. I can give him something to eat, something to drink. I can give him shelter. I can give him something. I can give him an encouraging word. I can remind him that he is loved by God. There is something we can do. And if we start looking at our lives like the Macedonians is, we can't solve all the problems, but we can do something. And we may be in poverty, but we have something to give. And ultimately, that's all God cares about. That's all God cares about when it comes to showing our generosity, that we give something, that we do something. Was it? Yes. Right.
I think we give our needs, but then we come to India and we give a whole lot to India. We used to do more with backpack buddies.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we do the best that we can. We still, even though we're over, we still give to help to around here. And I can see it, the congregation with us at this time.
It would be, I've been a part of a lot of congregations, and I don't know a congregation that gives above, I don't know. I just think the financial giving of this congregation is amazing. I think what we give is very, very good compared to a lot of congregations I've been a part of. Now, of course, our congregation has been very blessed in many ways. We have a lot of members that can afford to give and that have been blessed by God. And that's part of what this lesson is going to be about, is that, well, the next principle we get to, which is the Abraham principle. I don't know if I'll get to that today or not. Probably won't at the pace I'm going. But when we get to that, the idea is that when we are blessed with a lot, God expects a lot. The more blessings that we receive, the more blessings that we need to continue to share with others. And more about that point in a second. I'm glad you brought that up. I'm going to talk about more about the congregation and how we give and how we purpose in our hearts to give on the first Sunday, and then we find opportunity, well, here's something else I can give to, and I'm going to keep going beyond what I have purposed in my heart and do more. Wonderful idea, wonderful principle to guide our giving. So the Macedonians saw their ability and were not blinded by the fact that they were in poverty. They participated in the collection because they truly wanted to help. There was no guilt trip there. There was no Paul shaking his finger going, you are going to be lost if you do not give. You are jeopardizing yours. I mean, there was no coercion necessary here. They were joyful that they had the opportunity. It was desire, not necessity, that was their motivation. Pick up in verse 4. Paul says, begging us earnestly. The Macedonians begged us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. I'm going to ask this question in a second, but I'm going to ask it now because we're already talking about it. Why did they beg? Two different reasons. Why did they have to beg? Because who are they begging? They're begging Paul. So they had to beg Paul. Why did Paul make them beg? I don't know if he made them beg, but why is that situation necessary? Why did they have to beg? Sounds like Paul didn't want to add to their poverty, did not want to take as much as they were willing to give. That was not his first thought. His first thought was, this congregation, I mean, you're welcome to give, but I know there's a situation here where there's not going to be a lot of opportunity. So it sounds like Paul did a little convincing by the Macedonians here in verse 4, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. I love the way Paul phrases it, the favor. I mean, it's to our benefit. We are being favored by this opportunity to be stewards here. And this, not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. Accordingly, we urge Titus that as he had started, so he should complete among you, talking to the Corinthians, this act of grace. But as you excel in everything, in faith and speech and knowledge and in all earnestness and in our love for you, see that you excel in this act of grace also. So verse 4 makes it very clear that Paul initially was reluctant to accept their gift, but they begged. And evidently Paul considered them, poor. He knew their situation, did not want to contribute to their suffering, did not want them to feel obligated to give so much that it was going to make them suffer even more. But they didn't feel obligated. They said, no, this is to our favor. We are going to benefit from this every bit as much as those we're giving to, because this is what our life is supposed to be. And this is the opportunity we've been waiting for to show our generosity. Generosity to who? I hear some whispers. I can't hear them though. To other Christians, but also to God. The generosity is ultimately to God. This is our chance to give back to the God that gave us His only begotten Son. God doesn't need our money. I can't give God any money. I can put it in the collection plate, but that money does not go to God. It goes back out into the work of the church. It goes to do God's work on this earth. God doesn't need our money. It's an opportunity to be stewards. They earnestly begged. In our words, they refused to take no for an answer. No, Paul, we're going to give. Don't take this chance away from us. And again, we talked about this. Don't stand in the way of someone. Don't judge them and say, oh, well, you can't give to me. I mean, I'm in a position where, and again, it's kind of a haughtiness. It's kind of a sense where, I'm above you. You can't give to me. You can't help me. Find someone below you to help. And then when we look at each other like that, we're not looking at the way God would have us to look. If someone wants to help, let them help. Verse 5 indicates that Paul and his group were surprised at the response of the Macedonian Christians. And what was the foundation of their generosity in verse 5? They gave themselves first to God. And then, by the will of God to us. They lost, a couple weeks ago, we talked about that song, Sweet Will of God, lose my will in God's will. They lost their will in God's will. They replaced their will of what, I'm in poverty, I need food, I need to feed my family, I need a job, I need whatever I need to get out of this cycle of poverty I'm in. That will fell by the wayside, and they only saw, what does God need? God needs these Christians helped. Paul wouldn't be here asking if he didn't need to find help for these Christians that were truly suffering. Right. Yeah, I think sometimes we really miss that point that, when there's a collective effort to do anything in the church, anything, maybe I'm wired, I don't think I'm wired that differently than most people, but if I'm in the kitchen and I got to cook a meal, if there's 3 other people helping me, it's a pleasure to be there. I enjoy it. And I think back on all those lonely days I left my mother in there cooking by herself, and the 3 men in her life are, watching television or watching the Braves or do whatever we were doing. And I think, man, I'd have been miserable doing that day after day after day. But she did it. she was also, working a 9-to-5 job at the time. And but there's something, we do discourage others when we don't pitch in. We don't all participate. It's a lonely feeling sometimes, and I think we've all been there. We're like, we're doing the church lesson in the back on Sunday nights, and we talked about the 80-20 rule, the 20% of the people doing 80% of the work, or I think it's probably the 90-10% rule sometimes. So yeah, and giving's the same way. It's a lot easier to give when we feel like all of our collection, we may not be able to give but just a few dollars here, but you put that together and you look at what we're giving to India or giving to, and it feels like, you know what? I need to be a part of that. I need to be a part of that contribution. It has to be a collective effort. Knowing the will of God created their desire to be a part of the collection. They knew God would have wanted them to do it. They did it. What encouragement did Paul give Titus in verse 6? Again, encouragement. He's encouraging Titus to do something for the Corinthians in verse 6. I'll just read it. Accordingly, we urge Titus that as he had started, so he should complete among you, the Corinthians, this act of grace. Paul's urging Titus to encourage the Corinthian Christians to follow through on their commitment. And just like you were talking about, that others being willing to give as an encouragement. I mean, the whole reason this is being written about by Paul is that this is supposed to do what for the Corinthians? It's supposed to encourage them. It's supposed to say, you can do this too. There's no reason why you can't do this. And again, it's dangerously close to, it'd be easy to have that obligation effect on them. Well, they did it, why can't you do it? But also, if they can do it, think how much more you can do. You're not in their dire straits like they are. You can do this. You just need to allow God's will to be your will. So what encouragement did Paul give the Corinthian Christians in verse 7? He reminded them of something. You excel in what? Faith, speech, knowledge, earnestness, and love. And finally, I want you to excel also in this act of grace. He builds them up. He reminds them that you've got a lot of good things going for you. And now you need to add one more thing to the pile. Paul said the Corinthians realized they had experienced all kinds of spiritual abundance in their lives and all these things, faith and speech and knowledge and earnestness. And just as they had made abundant use of all those spiritual blessings, they were doing a good job of those things, they should also make generous use of the opportunity to give generously. And then we'll close this passage, read 2 more verses. In verse 8, 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 8, I say this not as a command, but to prove by the earnestness of others that your love also is genuine. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. I love the first part of this. It goes full circle with my long convoluted story at the beginning. I say this not as a command. So why did Paul say that? Right. It's sometimes just tell me I have to do it and I'll do it. Tell me I don't have a choice and I can do it. You know, we sometimes just want to be told what to do. Just tell me what I need to do and what I need to accomplish and I'll go do it. But it means so much more if we go, I know what needs to be done and no one has to tell me to do it. Nobody has to force me to do it. We've got to move our stewardship from obligation to gratitude. We're grateful for the opportunity, not through obligation. There were 2 motivations Paul's asked them to use in verse 8. First, David just talked about this. Realize the godly power of your example to others. Realize that when we give and we show gratitude and we show service and we show any area of stewardship, we are not just having an impact on who we are stewarding to, but who are witnessing it, who is encountering that, who is seeing the results of that, the fruit of our labor. And then motivation 2 has to be genuine love. Genuine love. Regarding Jesus Christ, what did they know in verse 9? I heard 2 answers, but yeah, for you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. Okay, so define that. What does that mean? If you were going to, somebody said, what do you mean the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ? What is the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ? He gave everything. He gave everything he had. And the example in verse 9 is he was rich. He was sitting on the throne of heaven. And he gave that to become poor. It's not just financially poor. I mean, he was poor in spirit, poor in every way possible. He was poor in, I didn't mean it that way. I meant poor in significance, poor in, he was not, right, no preeminence whatsoever. Appreciate you correcting that. They knew his grace. They knew the grace of Jesus used to respond to them. They should want to respond to others with grace. For their benefit, Jesus gave up every bit of the riches and splendor of heaven and became poor, insignificant. You know, there was nothing about the physical manifestation of Jesus. There was nothing significant about him. His position, his town, his family, although he was of the lineage of David, but that was seemingly forgotten. You know, their sincere motivation to assist the poor in Judea came from a clear awareness that Jesus had done something truly, truly special for them and truly something that was transformational, and they felt this was the obligation that they, more than obligation, this was their gratitude of what Jesus did for them. So stewardship is based on internal gratitude, not on external responsibility, and we've talked about this at length. I got into this portion of the lesson a little earlier than I planned, but you know, a Christian steward's primary motivation can never be that obligation. We don't take action because we fear the consequences of what if we don't? What's going to happen to us? Again, there's absolutely consequences for not being a Christian, not living a Christian life. There are consequences. There is a judgment day. I'm not saying those things don't exist, and I'm not saying those things should not be in our mind and we should be aware of the consequences. But you cannot build a Christian life on just the fear of the consequences. It has to go beyond that. It has to be a love of a love for the God that has given us all the opportunities to live eternal lives. A Christian steward loves his master, and the gratitude of love is our primary motivation. There are 3 reasons that Christian stewardship is lacking in the church today. 3 things that I thought about. First, I think the church has assigned too much stewardship to the idea of collecting money. You know, obviously stewardship is money. There is a financial aspect of it. And many of the examples that I've been giving in this series of lessons have been about, you know, the widows giving the mite, the Macedonians collecting money and from their poverty and still giving. So it's not just that. The greatest example of stewards were these poor Macedonian Christians who, yes, were giving money, but it wasn't about the financial. It was about the fact that they gave themselves to God first, allowed their will to be His will, and their generosity was an overflow of their love of Him. Secondly, too many Christians fail to understand that our total life must be surrendered to God's purposes. You know, we talked about earlier about how well this church can give financially, and there's no doubt about that. It's true. The church gives very financially. Everything is always taken care of. When there is an expense that comes up that's unexpected, it's amazing how this church always comes together and taken care of very quickly. The generosity of this church in many different ways. But in a prosperous society, I don't want to dismiss it, but money is pretty easy to give. It's not the widow's mite in our case at all times. What's harder to give in our situation than money? Our time. We're so busy. We got so many responsibilities. I live a long way from the building, or it's just it's a lot of trouble to turn around and come right back. And I mean, we come up with all kinds of reasons, and a lot of times they're good reasons. Like, well, I needed to be with this family member. I need to spend time with this or do that. I mean, and for us, it may not be money. It may be time. It may be effort. It may be, Don has preached a lot of sermons recently where I felt a little bit, oh man, I think he's speaking to me a little bit on this one. I felt a lot of them where I guess it's one of the great things about being a preacher that's not worried about having the job forever. He doesn't mind stepping on some toes from time to time, and I appreciate that because I have been impacted by several things that he's talked about and felt like, there's things I could do a whole lot better, and there's a lot of opportunities missed. Because, I'm just like, can't make the time right now. I got 6 kids in my house, and I moved recently, and I've got projects going on, and there's a lot of things that occupy my time. Time is the most difficult for us, I believe. We're running out of time. We cannot share our abilities if we don't give our time. The greatest struggle in the church today, I think, centers in service, not in finances. We've got to be willing to serve. I think we're more willing to hire it than to do it sometimes. It's very easy. We're going to let Roy do our missionary work. Well, there's missionary fields right here in Savannah. We're going to allow the Deerfield congregation to knock on our doors. And, I was as guilty as some of the others as anyone else about not being on all those bus trips, knocking on those doors all the time. I know not all of us are able to do all these things, but we have got to be willing to do and not just job out our service. We can't pay someone to do our work. We've got to be able to pitch in and help. And then finally, we have de-emphasized gratitude in our salvation. We place so much emphasis on the necessity to obey God, the necessity to be baptized. We forget about the gratitude we should have that we have been converted. And that baptism didn't convert us. God converted us. He changed our hearts. Baptism is absolutely essential. Don't walk away from this class thinking I didn't say that. But the conversion, God changes our hearts. Few have a sense, I think, sometimes of really, truly being saved. We were going to die, and God saved our lives, our spiritual lives. And if we truly have that kind of gratitude, we will fulfill our responsibilities. Okay, we'll stop there, and next week we'll get into the Abraham principle of stewardship. We'll talk about Abraham. Thank y'all very much. Appreciate all the good comments and the challenging thoughts. Appreciate it.